So now I'd like to focus on a specific and plot, maybe intensive discussion perhaps, of this work, RABID, the David Cronenberg work from 1977, which means that if you have not seen this film yet, then I strongly suggest that you turn off this video, and if you have a chance to watch the Cronenberg work, RABID, please do so, and then you can always come back at any time because this video will still be here on this channel, and then if you're still interested, you can check out the video at that time. So, but from here on, let us speak about the specific aspects of the film RABID going forward. And I must say that this is such a fascinating, skillfully, adroitly put together work that is so much filled with those Cronenberg touches of adaptation and also subversion of genre, and also the means that he has at his disposal, Cronenberg does, in order to speak about aspects of evolution, transhumanism, transformation, and progression, or maybe evolution, or it may be as a progressive way forward or as a regressive step backwards, depending on one's point of view and one's perspective, and how that affects the internal psyche of the individual, of the human spirit on the one hand, but also how it has its very dramatic and drastic external effects on the public writ large. And so this is something that we've seen in past Cronenberg works, including, and I think perhaps quite vividly, in a previous work called Shivers. And we will see it play itself out in a number of spectacular ways in other works going forward in the Cronenberg canon. So this is one key point that I'd like to focus on. And of course, in that discussion, I understand that it's really important to touch upon aspects of quote-unquote horror and quote-unquote sexuality, because these are two fundamental components, not just in Cronenberg's work elsewhere, arguably, but also quite fundamentally in the context, in the content and context of RABID. After all, it is a film that is about these things, the horror aspects, the vampire genre, the zombie genre, and also how sexuality, in particular the sexuality of the main character, seems to be intertwined into these two handlings of these various forms of genre or subgenre in the horror entertainment sphere. It's one aspect. So that's the content, but also the context is also very, very significant, because we understand that this is a film that is featuring Marilyn Chambers, who is a very prominent adult film star. And so that has a lot in terms of the, say, the reputation or the mystique or the branding or marketing aspect of this film, which is a horror film by Cronenberg featuring Marilyn Chambers in the main role, or one of the main roles. And so there is already this maybe built-in, almost subconscious perhaps, built-in aspect of what kind of expectation that might engender for audiences who are yet to see the film. And so the idea of sexuality intertwined both within the content of the film and also the context of the film. And indeed, how that aspect in terms of the context as well, the marketing, the production, the people who are appearing in, how that also seems to be turning a lot of things on its head, in a manner of speaking, in a wonderfully complex and rich Cronenberg type of way. So that's one, I think, main area that is worth talking about, or something that I'd like to try to address today, is that idea of type of convention, maybe not conventional is the wrong word, but a type of addressing or using or relying upon the wonderfully rich genre or subgenres of the horror entertainment and writ large, how that is linked to aspects of sexuality, and also how Cronenberg seems to be using those aspects, but also going against those aspects in very interesting and charged and quite provocative ways. So that's one area that I like to focus on. And also in the context of contexts, I'd also like to address, if I may, how this film is, I think, quite extraordinary in that it seems to have this way of connecting with specific aspects of the here and now. Now, the here and now that I'm speaking of at the time of making this video is February 2022, the year 2022. This film was made in 1977, but there are certain specific points of the backdrop and the plot that could be said to be quite eerily and quite chillingly finding a type of parallel in sort of socio-political events of the recent past year or so, leading up to February 2022. So I'd like to try to focus on those aspects as well going forward. But before that, let us talk about this film in the context of horror genre entertainment. And indeed, I think it's been described by Cronenberg and others, for example, some of the commentary tracks and the interviews with Cronenberg, etc., that this film, RABID, could be said to be a horror film that is relying on or maybe interpreting the vampire genre horror entertainment mode and also the zombie horror entertainment mode. And I think we can see that quite clearly in the main character, protagonist slash antagonist, that is Rose, the Marilyn Chambers character, and through a certain set of events that we see or privy to quite early on, indeed at the opening of the film. She and Hart are enjoying one day in the countryside, seemingly with the motorcycle ride, and then all of a sudden they have this really terrible and quite shocking accident involving a family car that's stuck in the middle of the road, and the oncoming motorcycle is unable to avoid the obstruction in time because of the high speed, thus leading to the really terrible motorcycle accident that injures the two of them, Rose and Hart. Hart is also physically injured, but more significantly and more seriously, Rose is injured, as we see, which involves a fire and also a lot of really terrible damage to her physical state. And so this is the opening, and this leads to the set of circumstances where the nearby clinic run by Dr. Kelloyd, which we understand is a clinic focusing in on plastic surgery techniques, is the nearest medical facility. And given the severity of Rose's injuries, it is determined that she has very little chance of surviving if an operation to save her life is not carried out very, very soon. And so under these emergency circumstances, we understand that Dr. Kelloyd and his capable members of his medical members of his clinic will undergo this emergency operation. So therein lies the very basis or fundamentals of what leads to the transformation of Rose, and we'll talk about that momentarily. And this transformation of Rose involves a very physically peculiar and ultimately quite frightening aspect involving her physical being, her inability to seemingly to have a sort of quote unquote ordinary or normal human digestive system. And as a result of that, her body has somehow or another developed a type of stinger or suction device that is emitted from out of an orifice that is found in her armpit. And through this device, she is able to suck the blood of any person, any separate person who seems to be in her grasp or in her maybe in her embrace. And so that leads to the suction cup being able, or the suction stinger being able to inject itself into the body of that other person, thus allowing for the flow of blood from that person to Rose's own internal digestive system, thus rendering her able to sustain a type of nutritious sustenance, at least from her perspective, her physical body, her own physical body perspective anyway. So this is the vampire aspect of the film. in terms of the monster. She is therefore the vampiric monster in the sense that she is causing havoc because of her blood-sucking aspects to her physicality, and also perhaps emotionally and mentally speaking as well. So she is the vampire monster in that manner. But already, I think we already see a brilliant way in which this is, while at the same time maybe going along with a certain type of what might be called genre convention in the context of the vampire sub-horror genre, it is already at the same time simultaneously going against that grain or turning it on its head, because it's not a type of vampire that might be understood to have certain traits in a sort of maybe a quote-unquote conventional sense, because also the actual instrument or device or thing that is the means by which Rose is able to suck the blood is something that is not through teeth or biting, but it's through the organ that is emitted from the orifice that is in her armpit. And so this is a kind of interesting sort of device or conception. And it is interesting because it seems so unexpected, and it seems very much quite unique, perhaps, if we were to think about her position in the context of, say, vampire literature and cinema. So that's an interesting aspect. Another aspect, too, that I think is both similar and also very much going with and also going against the grain, as it were, in terms of the vampire mythology or mythos would be, there's the idea, too, about the vampire and how this is the idea of the physical connection. And whenever one is talking about physical connection and one is talking about a type of satiation of desire or hunger, there are sexual connotations that are oftentimes accompanied in the context of, say, vampire attacks that are also releases of sexual desire, pent-up frustration, or a type of release of sexual desire, and that release is manifest in a type of physical connection between one person who is quote-unquote the victim and the other person who is the vampire monster or aggressor. But there's still undoubtedly a physical connection, and indeed that leads to, in many vampire stories, the notion of perhaps a very complex emotional-based relationship between the vampire and the victim. So that, I think, that leads the way for a number of various possibilities, as I say, in the context of the vampire genre or subgenre of literature and cinema. So in that vein, we can also see Rose, who is, if she is considered a type of vampire monster, her organ or her development physically that enables her to suck the blood of her victims itself, I think, could be described as having a very direct and potent sexual connotation, or various sexual connotations. It is, of course, the means by which she is able physically to connect with another person, her victims in these instances. So that's one aspect. So there's the physical connection, and also the physical connection is made because she, Rose, as we understand, needs to do this in order to maintain a sense of sustenance, a nutritional sustenance. And we understand later, or at least in the context of watching the film, we understand that her motorcycle accident injuries were of the extent that it seems that not only did she sustain injuries to her external person, that is, to her skin and her epidermis and the outer part of her body. Not only did she sustain injuries on the outer part of the body, but we also understand that Rose sustained very serious injuries internally. And we also understand that the internal injuries may have involved a significant damage to her intestines, to her internal digestive system, which explains why throughout the film, where she's seen like in the truck when she is hitchhiking and she's picked up by the truck driver gives her a sandwich, a steak sandwich or a meat sandwich, and she tries to eat it, but then she is seen later to be very, very sick. And so the implication is that she cannot eat or digest food or meat products of some sort. And later that is connected to the concept where she cannot digest anything, but the only way that she's able to satiate her hunger is through the use of this projectile, this thing that is emitted from her armpit. So therefore, this thing is a means by which Rose is able, therefore, to satiate her hunger. And so when we're talking about satiation of hunger, another way to think about that, or a parallel view of looking at that type of satiation, is the idea of satiation of hunger or satisfaction of a type of desire. And oftentimes, too, hunger, desire, sexuality, those are all portals, or those are all concepts that I think can be intertwined. And indeed, too, that type of parallel depiction or parallel treatment of hunger and sexuality in the context of Rose, I think is further helped along or abetted by the fact that the way that she's able to lure her victims, in a way, for the most part, is by the embrace. And in order to invite people into the embrace, she is, in essence, using herself, or exploiting the way that she understands other people in society, such as some of the men that she meets in the film. Not all, but some. Some of the men that she meets in the film seem to be objectifying her to the extent that they want to approach her in order to somehow make manifest their objectification of her. In other words, try to pick her up and have sex with her, or maybe even assault her, in the case of the farmer in the barn early on in the film. So, in other words, she seems to be able to either use this to her advantage or take advantage proactively in this way to bring these people close to her, so that she is then able to have them in the embrace, thus making them open and vulnerable to the sting from her armpit. So that is the way in which the stinger itself is very much an object of satiation, or the ability to satisfy satiation, which is also linked to sexuality, not only in terms of satisfying the need, but also in terms of physical connection. And this is also linked, arguably, to the vampire myth. But it's also turning itself on its head because, as I say, it's a very unique physical manifestation of that particular type of horror. And also, speaking of the physical manifestation itself, we have to understand, too, the design of it is very fascinating, right? Because it is a kind of an opening. It's a bodily opening, so it has this look that it could be said to be, this orifice type. But from that slit in her armpit emerges this thing, which I think could be described as somewhat phallic looking. So we have a sort of combination of different images, both perhaps in terms of genitalia and human genitalia, and human genitalia based images that could be said to be both maybe masculine and feminine, both in terms of the orifice and then also in terms of the phallic. And so we have them both combined into one. And so this, I think, has its really strong implications in terms not just of how the idea of the vampire is connected to hunger and satiation and sexuality, both in terms of genre conventions, very powerful genre conventions within the context of the vampire subgenre, but also how this is also a very Cronenberg way of completely turning this genre on its head in this brilliant Cronenberg concept. And also that links so nicely to another Cronenberg concept as well, which is the quote-unquote evolution of humanity and the human body, and whether that can be said to be either a total, complete evolutionary state, transcending the current human state from one state to a completely new state or form. And indeed, this idea of this organ that is sucking blood could be said to be, or interpreted to be, part of that Cronenberg trajectory of evolution. And or it could be described as, or akin to, the notion of transhumanism, and as a type of adaptation of certain aspects of the body, and how those aspects are adapted in order to have a better sense or connection with the outside world. And so these concepts are all intertwined. and all embedded and all within the very fiber and being of the actual concept of the character of Rose, as she has already made her transformation, as it were. So this is my way to say that in the context of the vampire aspect alone, we have so many things going on at once that can be said to be everything at once. Things that are both traditional and also very much Cronenberg-esque, or maybe to make it even more specific, things that Cronenberg are dealing with are, I think, undeniably quote unquote in the traditional vein, but also using those aspects and turning them on their head to create something that could be said to be different from the traditional vein. So it's all going on at once, I would say. And that is one example. Another example, too, of how this film seems to be going along with really effective genre conventions, but also turning them on their head at the same time, is the concept of how this idea of the vampire and Rose, what this turns into or mutates into when we have the particular plot of the film. And so we understand that a victim of Rose is somehow or another becomes infected with some kind of very, very strange infection that causes violent and quite chaotic outbursts, leading to, say, their victims, Rose's victims, having say slightly pus coming out of certain parts of their body. They're lashing out, wanting to eat people or bite other people, attacking others, etc. This has been described in the world of the film as being some kind of strain of rabies, or new strain or dangerous strain of rabies. Thus the title of the film, RABID. And so the idea here is that Rose's victims become infected. Interestingly enough, we never see Rose herself throughout most of the film anyway. We never see Rose herself infected. We don't see it. We're not sure how that works in terms of her being maybe in essence a type of carrier of sorts, or maybe it is the act of the penetration, the forceful penetration, some kind of transference of the disease, or maybe it's arguably another interpretation would be that it is the somehow or another the act of the penetration that somehow awakens something that is latent or within the victims themselves. Who knows? I don't know if there's any specific a scientific explanation that is presented in the film, but I think one can assume that this is something that has come about because of the various, say, events of surgical operation that have led Rose to the state that she is approximately 1 month after her motorcycle accident. So this is the second component of the horror, if you will, the infected. Now, this infected with the rabies or some kind of disease is spreading. The infection spreads, and also this creates this wide scale horror situation, which is akin to the zombie epidemic film. And the zombie epidemic film is a genre or subgenre that we can understand has many different manifestations. The root cause of the zombie plague or epidemic, it could be said to be a type of infection as well. It could be those root causes of infectious-based root causes are sometimes explained in the zombie film. Sometimes they are left out in the open, unexplained for viewers such as us to ponder and to interpret and to theorize about. But in any event, I think we can also see the second component, the second quote-unquote monster component of the film, is the zombie element, the infection zombie element, the spread of the plague element. And this is a very important aspect, because what this leads to is we have the breakdown of society. The particular society here is the various, say, the communities, the inner communities of the Kelloy Clinic, or the outer communities outside the General Hospital in Montreal writ large, Quebec, etc. And then the implications being that this is going to spread even further. And so how this particular plague or infection is affecting so many people at once, how the attacks in themselves, those sequences of attacks, are also the causes or the sources of the horror shock sequences that I think populate many aspects of this film very, very effectively. And then also how that is being employed as a means by which Cronenberg and company seem to be also engaging with a type of examination, the social, political consequences of this root cause of the plague or infection, and the emotional consequences that result in the context of, say, the intimate relationships or the breakdown of the intimate relationships that we have seen either hinted at or built up throughout the film. In other words, relationships that we see, friendships that are forged, that we see by the end of the film either break down or completely destroyed for one reason or another, that I think make themselves evident as one watches the film. And so in this type of description that I'm trying to give, I'd like to suggest, therefore, that this is very much part of the zombie infection plague genre, or it arguably is, but also it has links to the way in which one can see, or one can suggest or argue, that Cronenberg seems also to be using this as a means to make these further comments or further hypothetical based sequences. The hypothetical aspect being hypothesizing how, or to the extent by which, society writ large can be seen to be affected by aspects of evolution or transhumanism, the transformation of Rose from one state into another state of being that leads to not only her change, but also the changes to society and the drastic effects of that. And so it's not just evolution, but the effects of evolution. And I think this is a core concept of Cronenberg and his work. We have seen it arguably in his early works, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, and then Shivers. And we get a hint of it, I think, at Shivers in particular, in terms of the breakout. But then here we have the breakout and yet the broader, or say macro levels, or even more macro levels of society as a type of rippling effect that are being shook to their very core and being affected, and quite dramatically so, because of, as I say, these acts of transformation or evolution that are both physical transformations, sexual transformations, and also having their roots in the vampire genre and the zombie genre and the infection genre. So here's this way in which these, and another thing too is that we have these two genres that are linked up in this way. And so I think it's a really fascinating use of genre convention, at the same time as using those genre conventions, at the same time treating them in a way that is very wholly and very undeniably Cronenberg. So this in other ways are ways in which I think Cronenberg is handling the horror conventions in such a deft and a very adroit way, such a skillful way, and so effective too. Effective in particular because well, the set pieces I think are quite revealing. We have sudden bursts and shocks and jump scares. For instance, the reveal of Dr. Kelloyd in the police van there after that really scary attack in the medical theater, and he suddenly is revealed to be really infected full on with the rabies strain or whatever it is. I mentioned the medical theater sequence too. That is a frightening sequence in terms of what happens to him and how he suddenly, with the finger of one of the other doctors there, and then this whole medical theater and operation procedure, which would otherwise be just a standard operation, turns into this sudden moment of chaos and blood and everything, which is also the catalyst for, or the reason by which Rose is able to escape undetected from the clinic, and thus, unbeknownst to her perhaps, further spread what ends up being the plague or the rabies, or the new strain of rabies, whatever the strain might be. And so that is, those are aspects of the horror that are done really effectively, and also even the way that horror sequences are shown to break down key relationships, and the breakdown as well, combined with the horror and the special effects and the blood, I think create even more augmented chilling effects. For instance, the Murray Cypher character, the Joe Silver character, and what happens to him at the end. He's a character that arguably is a very sympathetic one that we as viewers get to know, and he has his relationship, a type of interesting buddy relationship that develops between him and the Hart and Murray. But then we understand what happens to poor Murray Cypher at the end when he goes to his family in his house. We understand he's a family man. There's a young baby, but something very horrible happens to his family, and also as a result happens to him as well. So that also becomes a real, I think, example of the source of the chilling and the horror in the hands of Cronenberg, that it's done so well, and it's throughout the film quite effective indeed. And we'll try to touch upon maybe other examples of those as we proceed with this conversation. Other things I'd like to focus on before I turn to maybe some socio-political aspects of the film. Before I turn to that, I'd like to focus in on more of the Cronenberg craft, or the way in which Cronenberg is telling his story in the context of the horror and the sex and the genre conventions and the turning the conventions on their heads. And I want to speak about this in, say, the example of the actual story behind what happens to Rose in the first place that leads to what she ends up becoming. And I would suggest that in that examination or consideration of that particular storyline, I think we can see that many aspects of the Cronenberg touch are there. I mean, many people speak about Ernst Lubitsch and the Lubitsch touch. I think we can also see that there's the Cronenberg touch, and it's all over this film, RABID. And to take an example, let's look at the story of Rose and what happens to her and her transformation. I think a lot can be revealed. We remember or recall that the film it opens with a shot of Marilyn Chambers as Rose, who is dressed up in the motorcycle leather gear, out seemingly in the countryside somewhere. And then we also see Hart emerge just in the second shot later. We understand that they are a couple and they're out enjoying themselves one afternoon motorcycle ride. But then because of this family in a separate car down the road somewhere is stuck, or there's an argument or something about directions. So they're in any event, the car is right in the middle of the road, and the motorcycle coming along at high speed, the oncoming motorcycle, because of the high speed, is unable to stop in time. So its only course of action would be to turn course, but that leads to the spectacular and quite frightening motorcycle accident that causes an explosion and something of the motor, the twisted metal falling on Rose herself, and then the fire and the conflagration and everything like that. And we also understand in the distance someone from the Keloid clinic has seen this. It's quite convenient timing, of course, coincidental timing, but this is a film, and that's part of this film. And of course, another source of maybe plot convenience is not the right phrase, but in any event, the Keloid clinic is the only clinic in the vicinity that would be able to provide the medical facilities for this particular situation, at which Dr. Keloid himself identifies in the ambulance as being very serious, and that if no medical procedure is done right away, then she might die. And so here we have the beginnings of what will become the transformation of Rose. And let's keep in mind, too, that the transformation of Rose here, namely the operation of Dr. Keloid, we should point out, it doesn't have any nefarious beginnings to it. The family in the car is not, I mean, they're just having a type of family, maybe a little argument between we understand to be the husband and wife, but it's nothing nefarious. The motorcycle riders, Hart and Rose, they're just having an innocent ride, and they seem to be in love. They're a couple. There's nothing wrong with that. Also, the Keloid clinic, nothing wrong or nefarious I can see anyway in any of their in any of what they're doing, what they're presenting to us. Even Dr. Keloid himself, who makes what could be said to be really controversial decisions about what type of operating procedures that he will employ, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Even if one says that, I think one cannot deny the fact that he still seems to be very much benevolent, not malevolent, but benevolent in his motives here. He wants to save this young woman's life, and he recognizes that the only chance of doing this is to to use his facilities at his clinic, Dr. Kelloyd's. And so there is nothing here that is malevolent or nefarious. And so everything seems to be done from a good place, from a place of benevolence. And so this is a very interesting set of events. And we can see maybe how this might have its further permutations or further representations or further changes as we see other Cronenberg films dealing with the motivations behind certain science-based methods or methodologies that are present in those films. But here in RABID, I think we can see that there's nothing but a good place in terms of the motivations. That being said, we also get a hint from Dr. Kelloyd and his discussions before entering into the medical theater at large about how they seem to be, or Dr. Kelloyd anyway, seems to be eyeing what might be deemed to be, from his vantage point anyway, a type of radical procedure. And the radical procedure, from his words, involves taking skin tissue from Rose's thighs, in other words, skin tissue from parts of her external body that aren't injured or that haven't sustained any damage from the medical or from the motorcycle accident, so her thighs, etc. Taking that skin tissue, then treating it, according to Dr. Kellogg, to use his words, treating that tissue to render it morphogenetically neutral. And so therefore the result of the treatment of such tissue to turn it into tissue that is morphogenetically neutral will be to have what he describes as neutral field grafts. And neutral field grafts that will have lost their specificity. In other words, these will be skin cells or tissue, bodily tissue that is not itself inherently, say, thigh skin or cheekbone skin or facial skin or something like that, but rather it can adapt into whatever part of the body it ends up being injected in. And so this is the concept of the morphogenetically neutral neutral field grafts that are the basis or the subject matter that are used in order to heal the injured parts of Rose's body. Now, during this scene, it's really important, I think. During the scene, Dr. Kelloyd mentions that, for instance, therefore, the concept being that you can take skin from her thigh and treat it in this way, and then that treated neutral field graft can be applied to injured parts of her body like her chest or her face, etc. And so it won't be thigh skin tissue that is grafted onto her chest, but rather neutral tissue that will be grafted onto her chest that will then grow into skin tissue for the chest. So that's the concept. He mentions it here to his fellow doctors in the theater. He mentions it in the context of external skin grafts. However, there's a really key point that he says before he enters, when he's washing his hands. He mentions this to his colleague about how, or his colleague mentions to him about how the procedure that he's planning could cause maybe cancerous growths, carcinoma, cancerous growths. And so the concept here also that is being hinted at is that this treated tissue is not only to be applied to external damaged parts of her body, but also to be applied to internal damaged parts of her body. That's the implication. So this then leads 1 month later, and we don't get any specific scene that indicates to us specifically that these skin grafts or these morphogenetically neutral field grafts that have been applied internally to her body or elsewhere have somehow or another developed into the orifice and the stinger that come out of her armpit. We don't get any of that explanatory scene material in the film. However, that is the, I think, very fair assumption or reasonable interpretation that one can have. That's the one that I have anyway, in terms of the transformation of Rose. And also I think it's really important too, because are not dealing only with the external damage, but the internal damage. This is a key detail because it explains, therefore, why Rose cannot digest normally. She has to, therefore, use extraordinary means by which to satiate the desires that are linked to her digestive system. The digestive system is an internal system. And so all of this, therefore, is suggestive of the fact that these morphogenetically neutralized grafts were applied not just externally to her outside, but also internally to her insides. And so if that's the case, then this thing that comes out of her armpit seems to be coming out of something that has been generated or has been created internally. There's also an external facet to it as well because of it comes out of the body. That's sure, I understand that, but also it has its internal aspects as well. So this is really, really fascinating on a number of levels. First of all, it hints at again, it's done from a benevolent place. Dr. Kelloyd is, at least as far as I see it, he doesn't seem to be an evil, mad genius doctor type of character. So that's one thing. So this is done from a benevolent place. So it creates an irony. Something that is done with good motives leads to something that has incredibly horrific consequences for the entire society, unbeknownst to anyone who is involved. So that's one thing. And the other thing, too, is I love how Cronenberg seems to be giving us some information, but also withholding information so as to enable us, the viewer, to try to put together the pieces as to why Rose is turning into what she ends up turning into. This is really great because it allows us, the viewer, to have a type of active presence, trying to put the pieces together ourselves to form our own interpretations of the work. And also because of that, we are able, therefore, to have various interpretations, possibly speaking of the film itself and why Rose becomes what it is that she's becoming. And also, because we have various interpretations, I think it allows us, therefore, to look at this transformation not as a horrific, maybe, accident of science, but also maybe as an unavoidable step in human evolution as well. And I think that is also hinted at in maybe the way in which we understand Cronenberg's chronology of films leading up to RABID and also beyond. There are also hints of it in certain aspects of the decor and the set design. There's one instance where we see, I think, when Dr. Kelloyd is looking after the first victim of Rose, which is Lloyd, we see in the back of the room a symbol that is very often understood to be representative of the concept of transhumanism. And so we have this back and forth, this push and pull. Very much like the push and pull of the actual thing that is emitted from Rose's armpit, which is this a step in a progressive step in the natural flow of evolution, or is it something that is regressive? And if that's the case, then what is the role of human proactive medical science in that? Is medical science turning humanity into something that is beyond its limitations, or is it turning it into something that is quite horrifying? Or perhaps they are one and the same. Who knows? In any event, this is I think, a really fascinating aspect of how the Cronenberg touch is already all over the place in the very build-up or the construction of the Rose character and her the essence of her transformation itself. So this is a really important thing. And also the idea of the transformation itself seems to be coming out of in this instance, RABID, it seems to be coming out of the need for survival. Remember, the operation on Rose is done because Dr. Kelloyd is, incidentally, the idea of Kelloyd, Dr. Kelloyd is being named Dr. Kelloyd, being a reference perhaps to the keloid, scar tissue, according to Cronenberg and Company, is another interesting touch. But even so, it's perhaps going against genre type in a way, because we understand that, as I say, Dr. Kelloyd is arguably not in any way a mad doctor type, at least before he becomes infected. And there's that scene where he obviously becomes a type of mad doctor type because he is infected, that leading to that really scary scene in the medical theater. But then going back to the idea of this operation having been done because it would be this or she would die. So in other words, her transformation is coming about because of the need for survival. She needed to survive, otherwise she would die. The only way, therefore, she could survive would be to undergo this transformation. Thus, the transformation is in many ways a type of outward output or a consequence of the instinct of survivalism. And so if this is the case, then this is also really, really important. Evolution equals evolution and transhumanism. That's one concept, but also evolution equals a type of need or as a manifestation of the survival instinct. And so this is also something that reminds, and this is, I think, a key part of evolution, right? Evolution, and then if we think about theories of evolution like Darwinism, etc., survivalism, then I think this further solidifies and embeds the notion of Cronenberg and his dealings with evolution in the context of the horror, vampire, zombie genres in the story of Rose and her own transformation from what she was before the accident to what she becomes after the accident. So this is such a really a brilliant concept. And also to the idea of the shock. There is some kind of shock event that is the catalyst, that is the marker of her state prior and state post, and that shock event is this motorcycle accident, or it's the results of the motorcycle accident that lead to the need for the operation, to put it more specifically. But in any event, the accident itself is the key event. Now, this is something that we might see in other Cronenberg works going forward as well. The shock event that seems to be either the catalyst or otherwise a metaphor representation for that switch or change from one state of being to another state of being. And I don't want to go into too many details now, but maybe this might come up in the context of later films by Cronenberg, such as, say, The Dead Zone, or such as, say, Crash, or others, but we will speak about those when we get to those. But that is another aspect of evolution and the change and transformation, the catalyst or representations or metaphors of such that we see here already in Cronenberg's work in RABID. And also it's linked really nicely too to that idea of motorcycling and speed, which is something that Cronenberg himself has identified as being something that he's really into. He's aficionado of motorcycles, etc., and models and makes, etc. So he knows this stuff, and so that it becomes yet a further way in which Cronenberg's own personal interests are linked in many ways to his subject matter of this and other films. So it's a brilliant conception all around. And the other aspect too of the Cronenberg touch is sex. Sexuality, human sexuality, and sex. And it is all over this film and Rose's story going forward. So we have mentioned a little bit about how she uses sex as a means to try to proactively get her victims. One, I think, really famous or infamous mode of this in the film is where she visits an adult movie theater somewhat later in the film, because she understands that maybe this is a place where she can lure men to her in order to have them be her next victims. And indeed, we see one of the results of that, and how she is very, almost cruelly plotting this particular, leading this young man along, and he has no idea of what's going to end up happening to him, but he is just a type of victim. And I think there's a lot of statements that can be made here in terms of the turn or the twist or the turning of the tables, as it were. A situation where maybe in that situation, or maybe let's take another situation earlier in the film, in the barn, and the attack by the farmer on her, wanting to very obviously rape her or sexually assault her. It's a very vicious scene, and so she has to defend herself. And here is yet a means by which she is not purposefully trying to lure him in, but rather she seems to be trying to resist him. And in the act of this resistance, physical resistance, she attacks him with the stinger. I think it lands in his eye. It stabs him in the eye at one point. So that is an example of the stinger being a type of mode of self-defense. And another way of looking at self-defense is the idea of survival. To protect oneself from a type of outward attack is a means of survival. Self-defense is survival. So the little stinger is a way to protect herself, active self-defense against this farmer who's obviously wanting to rape her. And that leads, of course, to his infection that we'll see later on in the diner, in another really scary sequence involving a meat sandwich, I think, and a waitress. But So that's one mode here. But then later on, which is in the pornographic movie theater, here she is actively using herself as a type of bait, but it's a bait by which she is ultimately not the victim, but she is ultimately the aggressor. And she becomes the aggressor. And this is not in any way a type of unwanted sexual advance from this young gentleman. In fact, it seems to be quite mutual. She wants him to come close, and he is very willing to come close to her. So it's a type of mutual sexual exchange, or the beginnings of some kind of mutually agreed sexual exchange that, of course, we understand each party has completely different concepts of what's going to happen in the sexual exchange or mutual sexual exchange. And we understand that Rose's objectives are quite vicious indeed and involve the physical penetration from her side to him in order to suck the blood. So already we have, I think, in that description, the turning of the tables in so many ways. The concept that the character, the young man, has is very different from the ultimate consequences of that scene. I don't want to put too much a fine point on it, but the idea of who is the victim and who is the aggressor, or maybe to put it in another way, that is in terms of sexuality and physical connection, the penetrator and the penetrated. And the tables are turned in that particular circumstance, because ultimately it's Rose with her stinger that becomes the aggressor or the penetrator vis-a-vis the victim, who perhaps had other ideas about who would be the penetrator and who would be the penetrated in that initial exchange between them in the pornographic movie theater. But in any event, this is a means by which sexuality is used by the characters within the concept or within the universe of the film, turning the tables, the use of sexuality or expectations of sexuality, and also understandings of how certain people in society view Rose, and how they are objectifying her, attracted to her, sexually wanting her. She uses this to her advantage to try to get what she wants, which is their blood. Now, this is a really interesting point, because not all of Rose's victims seem to be wanting that type of, say, sexual gratification when they encounter her. Arguably speaking, the first victim that she has, Lloyd, who is, right, I think quite evidently resisting or wanting to resist her sexual allure, as it were. He is at least showing a lot of discomfort because he initially entered her room after she screamed. This is in the Keloid clinic, and so he is arguably trying to help her. And it is in the state of trying to help her while also being confronted in this confused, agitated way that she grabs him and attacks him. So that's one way in which I think the type of sexual dynamics in which she is seemingly luring her victims or protecting herself. That's something that is, I think, absent in that particular exchange. Also, arguably, the truck driver that picks her up when she is hitchhiking, at least in the scenes that we see, and we see him giving her the sandwich, the meat sandwich, and then we see her violently react to it. She's sick, and she has to go to the side of the road, and she is physically sick, and he helps her back to the truck, at least in the scene. And then the next time we see him, we already see him, and he's already been injured, or there is an indication that the stinger got him. Now, we are not privy to what might have happened that led to that particular moment, but at least in the scenes that we see, there is no indication, at least I can glean, as far as any type of undercurrent of sexual based danger on the part of Rose from this particular truck driver. This truck driver too seems to be one that has benevolent motivations, much like Lloyd character. Also, by the way, too, what's so fascinating too, remember with the Lloyd character, the first victim, he is found with the blood on one side of his body, and the nurse assumes that Lloyd tried to sexually assault Rose while she was still in this coma state. And so that leads to the possibility of maybe the police might be involved, but Dr. Kellett, I think, either brushes it off or ignores it completely because he is more interested in how Rose's physical state is developing, etc. And then that leads to Lloyd going to the general hospital some scenes later, seemingly without any type of police escort. So maybe the implication that he wasn't arrested or anything like that. But the nurse's comment is really significant, because the assumption from the outside world is that Lloyd had some kind of sexual desire that he wanted to satiate, and that meant that he attacked Rose. Whereas, as I think we as viewers know, that that is not actually what happened. And so already we have that dynamic, which is, I think, on a second level, this type of way in which the objectification of this particular character, Rose, seemingly is being turned on its head, or the tables are turned. And so she is automatically assumed to be a victim in certain circumstances that involve, in particular, her relationship with men. She's automatically assumed to be the victim, or the passive part, the passive partner. Whereas, in fact, in a lot of the circumstances we see, not all, but most of them, we see that actually not being the case. And so this is really fascinating, the way in which perceptions and maybe societal mores or mores, or maybe conceptions or views, conventional views, let's put it that way, of genre, of gender roles, might also be playing into directly how Rose is interacting with the society around her, and also how the society is viewing her. And to add yet another level of wonderful complexity to this, we have to remember Marilyn Chambers. Marilyn Chambers is very much known at this time and beyond as a pornographic film star. And so that that reputation and that cachet is very much part of this. It's one of the things that's often mentioned. It's always mentioned when this film Rabid is being discussed. Cronenberg himself mentions it almost immediately when he first talks about Marilyn Chambers and the commentary tracks, etc. So Marilyn Chambers, porn star, Rabid, Cronenberg, it all becomes this package, as it were. And so that also is another, I think, interesting reflection or development in the way in which the universe of the film is handling concepts of societal constructed modes of observation and objectification, but how it seems that it's not always the case that those modes of objectifications are indeed exactly how things play out in in the actual circumstances of the film. Very much like how Marilyn Chambers, as a noted and famous pornographic film star, might be said to be therefore in a position of playing a role where the design or objective of such role is a type of gratification, sexual gratification on the part of the viewer, in order through a type of process of a cinema viewership that could be akin to a type of objectification of someone that we see on screen. So the concept of sexual gratification in watching pornography. However, what we get is not in any way a type of sexual gratification of the film when we're watching Rabid. On the contrary, we're getting a film that is very much flying in the face of that type of expectation, if one really had that expectation as a viewer going into this film. Because one can see that while there are moments of, say, female nudity, or while there are moments of situation that might be setting up the possibility of some kind of sex scene or something. On the contrary, when we watch a film, we see those moments of, say, female nudity that are, I think, bereft of any type of aspect of a purposefully applied way to titillate, a means of sexual gratification. Because, for example, those moments of, say, nudity or something are in the context of Rose in a coma state as a patient in the clinic, or also when she is physically quite agitated, and we understand that she is undergoing a lot of physical pain because of her insides, because of her damaged a digestive system. Or maybe she is just very innocently and very very almost earnestly, say, just wanting to get dressed and get ready for a night on the town, which we understand later will be quite a dangerous night indeed, at least for the people on the other side of that equation. And so this is therefore to say that this is not a pornographic film in that sense. And so that, I think, is another way too where we have, but it is a film about sexuality. It is a film about sexuality. It is a film about the use of sexual gratification, the concept of the use of the concept of sexual gratification, the use of the concept of objectification, and it's something that is acknowledged both off screen in terms of the embedded aspects of the production details. It's also acknowledged by the people who are in the universe themselves, and perhaps most of all acknowledged by Rose herself, because it is indeed Rose who is at least conscious of the fact that she can use this to her advantage, which is why she makes the choice to go to the movie theater to begin with, etc. So this is so overwhelmingly complex. It's beautifully complex. It's multi-layered in that way, and dealing with sex in this handling by Cronenberg, so masterful, so skillfully done, so brilliant stuff. Also, there are some rather fascinating offshoots of that conversation of sexuality. For example, I mentioned earlier about how it is often the case, or it can be very much a type of literary device to link metaphorically the concept, or physically even, or to have direct discussions about their similarities or the direct connections between hunger and nutrition and sexuality. And so it's oftentimes we have concepts of food and sex interlinked in really famous examples of cinema and literature. RABID is, I think, in that same vein. It's doing things that are really interesting here. As I mentioned, Rose is a character that has this offshoot from her armpit as a means to survive. It's her way to get nutritional value from the blood that she sucks from her victims. But it is still the way in which she's able, this is the only way in which she's able to survive, is to get this nutritional sustenance. It is sexual because of the aspects that I was trying to indicate earlier, the physical penetration aspect, as well as the design of the actual bodily organ itself, as well as the sexual implications that are involved both in luring and also the idea of physical contact and penetration. And then also the idea of satiation or satisfying a desire or lust or hunger. And therefore, in that context, what's so interesting is we see how the sexual desire or urge, if we can indeed call it that, of Rose, is it's not always directed to, say, one sex or one gender. Her victims tend to be, in the majority, male victims, although we do see female victims as well, and very noticeably so towards the end of the film. Even though she tries to resist it, Rose does, because it's involving one of her dear friends. But so there's that. Also, it's this idea of sexual desire and hunger, which can also be a concept that might be suggestive of some kind of uncontrolled lust or appetite. On the contrary, her sexual desire here seems to be, while there are bursts of, say, uncontrolled lust that seem to be manifest in these really spectacularly bursts of physical agitation on the part of Rose, for instance, when she attacks Judy in the hot tub early in the film. She suddenly grabs her, and it becomes this really famous scene of that sort. So that could be said to be a type of expression of some uncontrollable urge on the one hand. At the same time, there is a planning, there is a methodology, there is a type of predetermination that is on the, or not predetermination, there is a preconceived notion of what her attack will be. And so there is uncontrolled urges, but there's also very controlled, very methodical and ways in which she's approaching. And it's, as I say, there's a scene at the end where she says to her young friend in the apartment, "I don't want it to be you." Because that is suggestive of the fact that she is conscious of the fact that her urges are things that she can control, or she will try to control, but there is a point of no return, because ultimately her friend becomes her next victim, as I say. And also that plays with the idea of there is no specific gender that Rose seems to be focusing on in terms of her victims. Also, there's an interesting focus if we're talking about food and sex, the idea that she cannot get sustenance from animals. She tried early on with the cow, I think, in the barn, and we realized that she had her body had a really violent reaction against that. And so her only mode of sustenance is human blood, apparently. That's the concept. And so this is a really interesting maybe line. And there's also a scene where she's seen to not be able to eat steak sandwich or meat sandwich. So there's maybe a possible discussion there with regard to the way that sex and nutrition is linked to maybe, I don't know, like meat eating carnivores, herbivores, and also perhaps the concept maybe also an offshoot of that would be Rose and sex and nutrition and the lust for hunger and vegetarianism, perhaps. I'm not sure. But although maybe if one goes that way, one has to be reminded too of the fact that her victims are indeed humans. And so she is in that way a type of meat eater in one form or another. But my point here is that I think that type of possible discussion is indeed it's a possible avenue, let me put it that way. Now, before I turn to other aspects and then conclude, let me now return to or point out how this film Rabid also, in my view, is touching upon many points of socio-political, say, current events or significance that are very prescient and quite frighteningly and chillingly and eerily similar in terms of what might be said to be the state of the world or state of affairs in today's climate. Again, we're making this video February 2022. This film was made in 1977, but there are already parallels that can be said to be worked into this film quite ingeniously so. So one thing that has been often remarked upon, it's remarked upon, for example, here in the essay that's included in this particular version of RABID here, but the idea of the October crisis of 1970 in Quebec, and the October crisis, which involved the Front de Libération du Québec, oftentimes referred to as the FLQ. And this was at the time a group that was, we understand, employing quite violent public means to try to achieve their particular goals. And one of those particular instances involved the kidnapping, a very public kidnapping of two public officials, one being James Cross, who was described as a British diplomat, trade-related diplomat, and then the other being Pierre Laporte, deputy premier in Quebec. And so these incidents in and around October 1970 led to a number of really frightening circumstances. One being that the War Measures Act was invoked, which was a law that allowed, therefore, for a heavy police presence, a expansion of police powers. The number of arrests, we understand, went up during this period of invocation of that particular law. And also, I understand, too, the halting or suspension of certain civil liberties, such as, I think, very notably, the halting or suspension of the right based in habeas corpus. So this is a period of history, of Canadian history, which is referred to as the October Crisis period of 1970. And it had a number of various circumstances and conclusions to it, one of which being the discovery of the murdered body of Pierre Laporte, a really set of tragic circumstances, as well as what happened as far as the fallout is concerned, and how this is regarded as a period of tumult for a number of reasons. And one of the sources of debate even now is the means by which the government seems to have applied the War Measures Act and what the results were towards or against the concept of civil liberties and the heavy police presence. Now, this has its parallel in RABID in terms of how the society Montreal and Quebec writ large, are trying to react to this particular crisis of the spread of the disease. And so we have the heavy police presence that is just building and building and building. The public are being they have there are instances where they're maybe rounded up, or they have to go through checkpoints and show identification, etc., show that they are not infected. There are all the other moments of patrols, armed patrols of the streets, people in hazmat suits, armed guards, etc., that are shooting down at will. It seems anyone who seems to be infected, thus killing people that they think, or they have maybe a reasonable view, is infected. So this is another really frightening aspect of this. Also, we do have, there's an instance where the character, very briefly on a TV, is described as being a director of the WHO, Dr. Gentry, and he's being interviewed, and his advice is the idea of these victims of this infection appear to not be able to be cured, and so one might as well just kill them. And so this is, I think, a further augmentation of this idea of the expansion of police powers that can lead not just to the curtailing of civil liberties, but in fact death and very violent outbursts of death. And so those outbursts of violence are being caused not just from the infected, quote unquote, zombie or infected plague, but they're also being caused by people who are in authority. Most notably, for example, or one of the great examples of this is the scene towards the end in the mall. And one of the infected is seen running towards a Santa Claus event, and one of the policemen, who's armed with a machine gun in a mall, decides to shoot down this person in a crowded mall with the machine gun, but he ends up killing as well the Santa Claus. Now, it might be a brief thing, and because of the Santa Claus outfit, it might be seen even to be almost a really dark sense of maybe scene of humor in the film, and I get that interpretation. But it is also, I think, in line with, parallel with that, it's also a very violent, maybe, metaphor for the idea of the expansion of the police state in this period of arguably, yes, a medical emergency crisis, but this is, I mean, this is really the idea of proportionality is being eroded if it's causing the death of innocent bystanders. So here is, I think, that is a great metaphor. That scene is a metaphor for how this film is handling the October crisis. And Cronenberg himself reminds us that this film was released in 1977. So audiences in Canada would still remember and know the October crisis, and so they would probably recognize these particular allusions to recent Canadian history. So this is a really important thing. And to link it back to the world of Cronenberg, this is being used, again, as a result of what is going on with the chaos that came from patient zero, in a manner of speaking, Rose herself. And so it is the idea, if Rose can be seen as an example or a metaphor for transhumanism or evolution, it is the way in which society, at least the present society or current society, seems to be reacting against that. In other words, if the fundamental result of the evolutionary change is the change of society vis-a-vis the spread of the disease, turning people into new forms of human life, rabies infected creatures, yes, but still a new form of life, then this type of reaction by the government and the police could be said to be an attempt by the government, the current society, to put down and defeat the new order. So it's the old order trying to fight back against the new order. And this idea of the old versus new, the current versus the new, the established order versus the revolution. And it is embedded in the concept of horror, and evolution is also embedded in the concepts of the socio-political. We'll see it in other films by Cronenberg, and indeed, it's a direct reference, as Cronenberg himself reminds us, of the October crisis. And I should point out, too, not to belabor the point further, but just to point out that we're in February 2022. And arguably speaking, yes, even now in February 2022, there is a very, very similar set of circumstances that is currently ongoing in Canadian politics. And so for those of you who are following Canadian politics and sort of what is described as or viewed as from a certain point of view to be an emergency state of situation or emergency state of affairs in regards to Canada, then we can see further that that is suggesting that this film is not just a parallel of a parallel, but it seems like there is a parallel of the parallel of the parallel. So there's an echo of an echo of an echo. And so that is, coming back to the film, is highly suggestive of how prescient and how current this film really, really is. This is such a current film, for example, in the context of the socio-political dynamic of Canada. And that's one thing. The other thing, too, is we are, again, living in February 2022 at the time of making this video. And as we know, over the course of, say, the last couple years, the whole world has been having to deal with the pandemic and infection, coronavirus, COVID-19. And while the film RABID is not dealing directly with this same type of infection, it is a film that's still talking about infection. It is a film that is still talking about disease, a highly spreadable, contagious disease. And also, the film, when you watch it, you see the details, which I think are very eerie, in that they speak about vaccines. They speak about having what is described as being a pass to prove that you have received a vaccine. There are checkpoints to check these particular details. You can't, the news reporter says at one point that the public are not allowed to go outside in the streets unless they can prove that they have been protected, etc., as you can see. And also there's a particular scene where a character that is gunned down because he showed signs of being infected. He's described later by a police officer in the jail cell as being, this was someone who had received the rabies shots early on, and he still became infected. So that also is hinting at the efficacy of vaccines, or the how effective vaccine shots are, or not flu shots, but rabies shots are here. Now, I think if you're still with me in this video, this already long video, and I apologize for that. If you're still here, I think you can already begin to recognize that these little points in the film, and they're just, again, scattered about here and there, they are still very much part of the current conversation, even in February 2022. So this film, therefore, holds such a chilling, almost a sense of being able to look into the future, what will happen. And it is speaking about it in a way that is so current and so direct. And I was, as I say, watching it now in this current climate, in pandemic or post-pandemic climate. And the currency of this film is it's frightening, absolutely frightening. So that is another way in which I think this film, and perhaps two Cronenberg films overall, have this way of lasting over time in their, I think, earnest attempts at trying to deal with or discuss the relationship between humanity and medicine and science. And sometimes that is a very beneficial relationship, but also it can be a relationship that holds a lot of mysteries and indeed a lot of inconsistencies and also disputes along the way. And so I think that in that context, we can see how current this work is. Again, we're in February 2022. This film was 1977 still. The connections are mind-boggling in that regard. And maybe to conclude, I mean, I can also say that it is a film that is playing too with various concepts of, say, genre. I mentioned the vampire and zombie or infection films, infection plague films, but there's also the way in which this film can be seen to be maybe relying on the porn star cachet of Marilyn Chambers to try to market this film as a maybe B-movie film or exploitation film. I wouldn't necessarily agree with those sorts of marketing details, but I can see how that might be a way to have this film be marketed in order to reap a profit. And that's also very important in the context of commercial cinema and art. But this is therefore a film that I understand has been described also as a B film, as a B horror film. And I think that's something that is not to be ashamed of. And I don't think Cronenberg himself is at all ashamed of that at all. Because this is also an example of how Cronenberg films can be very malleable, and they can be films that can potentially reach a whole wide range of audience. And B movie films, there is a real genuine spirit of entertainment and shock value in a lot of that independent filmmaking spirit. And there is a lot of that spirit here in the film Rabbit. And I rather than be ashamed of that, I think those aspects should be applauded and celebrated to the nth degree, because they are really quite fantastic in how they provide these shocks and scares and modes of entertainment, but also linked to these really deep and profound themes that I was trying to allude to earlier in my very, very terrible manner of speaking. And I apologize. I can't explain it very well. I'm so unable to grasp these concepts. And so I am not at all an expert. I'm not an academic, and I wish I could explain it better, but I can't, and I don't have the ability to comprehend everything. But you know that. But I do want to try to suggest that, despite my very poor comprehension, I can still see Rabbit as being this really multifaceted work that is so important and so groundbreaking, and thus so alive in the Cronenberg canon. I do acknowledge too that there are some bits that maybe don't quite make sense. For instance, at the very end, when Hart confronts Rose in the apartment there, after he sees the thing that protrudes from her chest, not her chest, but from her armpit, he is able, therefore, to put two and two together and then deduce immediately that she is the cause of the rabies plague. Now, that is incredible act of deduction on his part, Hart's part. So I'm not sure how he was able to put that together at such speed. And that's another point too that is really interesting, which is we don't know at first glance what Rose's condition is when she attacks the first victims. We get flashes, we get indications. Of course, when we watch the film on rewatch, we understand what her condition is. But at first, I mean, go back and watch the first victim scene with Lloyd in the bed. We never get any sense of what Rose's condition is. And so that is revealed quite slowly. And so that is another way of saying that the Cronenberg method of revealing information is very controlled, very, very mannered, and it withholds things until a certain point. But if we were to play along with that concept in parallel, it's really remarkable that Hart at the very end was able to put everything together at once immediately. So that's something that I'm not quite sure that I more or less buy. Also, I'm really fond of the performance, don't get me wrong, but maybe as a character, I'm not sure how likable that particular character is. And indeed, Rose at the very end lashes out at him, saying, "It was your fault, it was your fault," which is another aspect I think would have been, it could have been explored very much. So I don't know if it's explored that much in the film, but it's hinted at, in other words, the guilt of Hart, because it was essentially his motorcycling abilities that led to the accident, that led to the situation of Rose at the very to start the ball rolling in terms of the horror film that is Rabbit. So, but so maybe there are some aspects that are indeed could be considered to be somewhat weak aspects of the film, and I certainly see those. But those are still accompanied by aspects that are very strong, very, very strong. I would also cite, when we're speaking about the end of the film, while there might be some weaknesses here, there, and elsewhere, even at the end of the film, there's also a really strong measure in this way, in the way in which this film is punctuated at the very end. The call between Rose and Hart, and the way in which Rose is trying to use herself as a type of test case to see if she really is the source of the infection. And she essentially sacrifices herself in order to find out the truth about that, which is a really scary and shocking and tragic scene between the two of them over the telephone, and Hart has no ability to save her whatsoever. And that is further punctuated in terms of the tragedy by what happens to her body and the dog, and her body's just flung into the trash compactor truck like just a piece of trash by these hazmat suited people. And that puts a further final and chilling end or coda to the proceedings. Much like many of the zombie films of the golden age of the zombie films like Romero, etc. Here we have the same type of setup. It's a character that we have come to know, and who's treated in this cold and vicious and very coldly scientific manner as an unknown. Although we know that she was indeed patient zero. So there are certain weaknesses. There's also maybe a scene which I know has been commented upon in other places about maybe the way that certain it's kind of brief, but there's a certain way in which this film might be seen to be treating certain racial or ethnic groups in a way that might be seen to be demeaning or condescending. So while it's brief, it's still something that I think it should be acknowledged. And so this is a way for me to try to suggest that this is not a perfect film. I don't regard it as being a perfect film. And I don't think the filmmakers would themselves regard it as being a perfect film, but it is a film of its age, it is a film of its era, 1977, and in that context, it's also a film in the hands of Cronenberg, who is still undeniably a filmmaker of the highest order, who is dealing with concepts and themes and ideas that are so rich and textured. And this film, Rabid, it is a B film. It is also many other things. It is a film that is exploding onto the scene of the Cronenberg canon in ways that are just unbelievable and wild and imaginative and so much out there. This is a film that is so Cronenberg. This is the work Rabid. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so I will be continuing on with the Cronenberg discussions going forward. But in the meantime, I hope that this video finds you well, and until we meet again, please continue to be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. So thank you as always for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.